Welcome to our Future Transaction podcast, brought to you by Forces Children Scotland, thanks to funding from the Scottish Veterans Fund. Future Transactions is about supporting families to get prepared financially for when the time comes to leave the armed forces and make the transition to civilian life. From providing useful information and advice to sharing lived experience from veteran families, we hope you find this podcast useful. And today, I'm delighted to say we're joined by Christina from the charity Fast Forward, and we're going to learn how gambling harm can affect resources, relationships and health, all key components to making a successful transition in civilian life. So first and foremost, Christina, welcome. How does it feel to be on the podcast today?
Delighted to be here, thanks.
Great. It's great to have you here, and don't worry, you're in safe hands. It'll be fantastic. So I thought we'd start off the podcast today, Christina, by exploring the gambling industry. And I'm wondering if you could just tell us and define what gambling is, and maybe give us a bit of insight into some of the popular sort of gambling habits and channels that we find in everyday life.
Sure. So gambling is risking money or something of material worth on the outcome of something that's uncertain in the hope of winning more money or a prize. So even if you're not spending money, it might still be considered gambling, such as using personal items to place wagers between family and friends, or using in-game items and video games to place bets online. Gambling's increasingly normalized in Scotland and across the UK, and that can understandably mean that people think of it as it must be harmless because it's everywhere. Products are visible all over the place in everyday life, such as scratch cards at the checkout. Advertising is also quite visible, TV, ads, on the radio, social media, and online. And bookies often have pride of place on high streets, often located conveniently next to pubs, takeaways, off licenses. And we know that they also tend to be concentrated in more deprived areas. For many people, their first experience of gambling is from a young age, and that might be picking lottery numbers with a friend or family member, or attending a football match and helping choose what bets to place. We also know that for many people, it's something that's social or kind of community-based. For example, attending a regular bingo night at a community venue, or placing some money on a lucky dip or raffle at the workplace or at school. And people who gamble occasionally, or even people who gamble regularly, don't tend to identify with the label gambler. Not everybody sees themselves in that way, but something that we're keen to emphasize is that all gambling carries a risk of harm. Technology has come a fair way in recent years, and products are increasingly being designed using neuroscience and behavioral psychology to start and then escalate spending quickly and to form habits quickly. Once online algorithms notice that you might be interested in gambling, whether that's because you've clicked something or liked something or searched for something, or even if you've signed up for an account with an operator online to engage with one particular product, you might find that you then are flooded with ads or free bets or other promotions. And something we often see is cross-promotion, which is where you've engaged with one product and then you receive promotions, ads, and free bets for other new products that you haven't engaged with. And this is where we can start to see kind of escalation of gambling come in, because either you're now gambling on more products, which is linked to experience of harm, or you might potentially end up engaging with products that are higher risk than the one that you started with.
I think it's interesting because you talked there about sort of behavioral psychology, algorithms, cross-promotion, and I'm thinking about AI and how much that's emerging and how quickly that's emerging. So I can only imagine that can be quite concerning.
Absolutely. I think something related around virtual reality can kind of boost that engagement that people can feel with the gambling environment. And we know that advertising algorithms that use this kind of intelligence to shape ads or shape who receives them can be really problematic for people experiencing harm, because they're more likely to be influenced and more likely to see kind of behavior changes as a result of advertising. Gambling ads can make it seem glamorous, fun, social, and we often hear in the news about people who've won the lottery and it's changed their lives. What we don't hear so much about is the vastly more people who've lost money, and that's something that could have gone to something more tangible. Customer losses mean that the gambling industry makes £14 billion a year, and that's more than the gaming and music industries combined. Like with other industry that market harmful products such as tobacco or foods high in fat, sugar, and salt, we also do hear about industry using predatory tactics. For example, continuing to advertise to people who've asked to stop receiving it, or send free bets to people who've self-excluded. Self-exclusion is when you arrange with one or more operators to prevent you from gambling for a set period of time. Fundamentally, products are designed such that house edge is built in, and we know that over time, if you're gambling, you will lose money.
And I think it's really important, Christina, that at this point in the podcast that we make it quite clear that there's many in the population within the UK that will gamble quite in a safe manner. But I think we're going to explore it later in the podcast too, but there's significant risk factors for when it spirals into gambling harm. So I'm thinking it might be quite interesting at this stage, maybe just to look at a couple of these risk factors.
Absolutely. So we know that people within the armed forces community are significantly more likely to experience harm around gambling. And a variety of other factors, such as among adults, younger adults tend to be at higher risk. Depending on the product, there are different demographics who are more likely to engage with them. So we know that males tend to be more likely to gamble historically, although the gap between the genders is changing. I would also say that some products carry higher risks associated with them. So examples would be products that are quick, so where you can bet money in quick succession, or where they're accessible 24/7. So there's no natural built-in cooling off period.
Yes.
You can engage with it overnight whenever. And also products that are repetitive. So where you're doing the same thing over and over. If you think of, say, online slots, where it's that same activity over and over, that can lead to a sense of zoning out. And we see that people, particularly people who've experienced traumatic life experiences, are at high risk. But all of these kinds of products carry much higher risk. So examples of products that are quick, 24/7 access, and repetitive would be online casino games like slots or roulette, even bingo. And within sports betting, in-play betting or micro betting. So in-play betting is when you're betting on something as it's happening, and that can lead to kind of more rapid and impulsive bets being placed. And with micro betting, that's betting on not just the outcome, but on little events that might happen throughout, whether somebody will receive a penalty or offside or what that might look like. So we know that these kinds of products are tend to be higher risk and tend to escalate more quickly than some others.
And would you say what I would describe as it's quite bespoke betting, does that give the illusion of control, Christina?
Absolutely. Particularly around events, there can be this narrative that if you know your team, or if you know your sport or what you're engaging with, then it's a sure thing, or that you can beat the odds. But what we know is that over time, you will lose money. So it plays into the industry's narratives for that sense of control to be built.
Yeah. And, you know, I think we just touched upon it, that there's many in the United Kingdom will gamble safely, but these are the risk factors, and that's how it can spiral out of control into harmful gambling. But I'm also quite interested to get your opinion on the legislation. I understand that legislation tends to be quite slow in terms of of combating the impact on the ground.
Yeah, so I think that's something that's an experience with a range of harmful products, and particularly those that are connected to technology. I think it can be difficult for legislation to keep up just because technology is developing so quickly. So it's almost kind of built into these technologies that we're going to need to play catch up in terms of
Absolutely.
regulating. But I think that's what makes it so important to engage with people on the ground in advance of legislation, which is a very necessary element of harm prevention, to be on the lookout for risks that might be new. So because products are developing all the time and there might be new features that we've not heard about, people might be engaging with products that they haven't had prior education or inputs about. So it's building that critical thinking and that ability to notice risk and to manage it in everyday life in a wide variety of contexts, not just with gambling, but with any products that are related or even unrelated around technology.
Okay, so moving on to our next topic, Christina, we're going to now look at what harmful gambling could present itself as. So we've talked about the risk factors with regards to when safe gambling can then go to harmful gambling. So I wonder if you can just tell me about some of the impacts of harmful gambling based on the kind of resources, relationships, and health model.
Sure. So in Scotland, it's estimated that 200,000 people are experiencing or at risk of experiencing harm from their gambling. And we know that people in the armed forces community are more likely to experience that. It's also, so for every one person who's experiencing harmful gambling themselves, on average, 6 people close to them are affected. That can be surprising, these kinds of numbers, because we don't tend to think about harm from gambling as particularly visible or prevalent. But one of the reasons we say that that's the case is because it's a hidden addiction. So unlike with substance use, for example, where there might be more visible signs, maybe smells or paraphernalia associated with it, with gambling, you could be gambling on your phone in the middle of the day in public and no one would ever know. So we often talk about, as you've referred to, harms from gambling in terms of 3 categories. So resources, relationships, and health. Around resources, the most kind of obvious forms of that would be finances, potentially getting into debt or bankruptcy. But it can also have an impact on work and school and opportunities around that. So potentially lateness or absenteeism or poor performance in school or training or at work, which can then lead to missing out on opportunities, maybe missing out on promotions, and ultimately unemployment, which is often connected to experiences like homelessness. At a societal level, it's also expensive. So gambling harm costs the UK government £1.17 billion a year, estimated, and that's mostly from strain on the NHS. Around relationships, that can look like increases in tension or arguments around the home, and that can lead to things like relationship breakdown, which is also potentially connected to homelessness. At a community level, that can also impact on things like social cohesion and trust. Around health, we know it impacts both physical and mental health. So that could look like losing sleep or not taking care of yourself in the same way that you ordinarily would, whether that's not eating right or exercising or doing the things that you would usually do to kind of take care of your well-being. And it also is connected to poor mental health, whether that's experiencing guilt or feelings of hopelessness, irritability, anxiety or depression, and unfortunately, it's also connected to suicidal thoughts and behaviors. So when we talk about people who are experiencing harm from their gambling, we sometimes talk about that in terms of a cycle. So while most people who gamble are not experiencing harm from their gambling, there are some kinds of behaviors that can start to escalate risk. And because we know all gambling carries a risk of harm, it's important to think about what that kind of continuum of behavior looks like. So at one end, that looks like occasional gambling, something that's done recreationally, and where you expect to lose, but you hope to maybe win. As things start to escalate, maybe in the at-risk category, people might be experiencing feelings of guilt around their gambling, maybe starting to spend more money or more time than they'd intended to, so starting to see a bit of impaired control. And at the more severe end of things, experience of harmful or disordered gambling, that's where control is impaired and you start to see impacts on a wide range of things around your resources, relationships, and health. We know that people, even people experiencing harm from their gambling, tend to move between these categories over time. So they won't tend to stay in any one for a good chunk of time. It's sometimes impacted by what's going on in their lives, or it may be impacted by the products they're engaging with. And so I've referred there to people experiencing harm and people at risk. Those two categories make up about 5% of people who gamble, but they represent 60% of industry profits. So a huge proportion
Very
of profits.
interesting stat there.
I've referred to disordered gambling. So the gambling disorder cycle, it looks very much like cycles around substance use, for example. So it can be helpful to kind of think about it in terms of that cycle with very similar stages. So at the first stage, you've got the gambling activity, which is where you're engaging with the product. And there's a fast rush of the feel-good chemical dopamine, which can be quite habit-forming quite quickly. The next stage would then be experience of withdrawal. So here, you start to see people either needing to spend more money or time on gambling to start getting that same rush, or they might be starting to feel a need to chase losses. The stress system is activated, so that can be linked to irritability, to anxiety and stress and depression. And that builds on that craving to gamble, to escape from those kind of negative experiences. Then moving on to preoccupation or anticipating gambling. Here we see people's, their craving systems are heightened and their impulse control in the prefrontal cortex is numbed. So that impacts on decision-making and self-regulation. And that can mean for people that cues like gambling ads that we've referred to in the environment can be particularly impactful and have a big sway because of what's going on in people's brains at that stage.
Yeah, because you consider, I mean, I think we're going to bring up the gambling behavior continuum and gambling disorder cycle up on the podcast, so those listening in can see these. But it's just such an interesting factor when you think about the continuum, like you were just saying. For example, it could be demographic topics, it could be socioeconomic topics, life events. So at any given stage, you're right, with these algorithms and the AI and the behavioral psychology, I think we could all be potentially quite vulnerable to spiraling out of control into gambling harm.
Absolutely. So depending on what you're going through at any time, if you happen to be going through a low point, or if you've experienced something traumatic, that's where we might see the rush that you might get from engagement with a gambling product having a particular sway over people.
Sure.
And something that so if you do notice that you've started to spend more than you've intended, or you feel that gambling is starting to negatively impact on you, we'd always encourage people to reach out for support. If people do decide to gamble, what we would suggest is to go into it prepared and with a plan. So the first thing is to be aware of industry tactics. So know that over time, you're going to lose your money. That's the way products are designed. To set money and time limits before you go in, and to stick to those. To make it a rule not to gamble when you're experiencing any extreme emotions, whether that's feeling lonely, feeling isolated, but even extreme positive emotions, because that's where gambling can start to be, to form a habit. It starts to be connected to those extreme emotions. We'd also suggest keeping a balance in life. So don't let gambling be the only way you socialize with a certain friend group. Make sure that you've got a variety of ways of connecting with people, and that it's not the only way you have of relaxing or managing that. And not to gamble on credit.
Yeah, because I think I almost had a moment of realization there myself that I've never gambled, but I'm thinking at any given point in a life event, and you're right, just when you're scrolling through your feeds on social or whatever it is, there's always these opportunities to gamble, or you're at the football or wherever you're at. So I think that's fantastic advice, isn't it, for anybody who is already experiencing gambling harm, but also feels that they might be at risk, or they feel they may be spiraling out of control, isn't it? It's great advice for any stage in that continuum, would you say?
Yeah, I'd say too, though, it can be tricky once you start to get further along into actually experiencing harm, it can be really hard to follow these tips. It's much easier said than done, particularly given the kind of impacts on decision making that we've discussed that you
Sure.
can experience. So I'd say that if you've started to experience harm or impacts, reach out to get support with managing that, because there are so many different forms of support out there. Loads of peer support, which I think people tend to find really helpful. And also, just to say, when I refer to people who experience harm from the gambling of someone close to them, there's also support out there specifically for people impacted by somebody else's gambling.
And that's something we're definitely going to do in partnership, where we're going to make sure that, if you are looking for any information, advice, helplines, we're going to provide that on Forces Children Scotland's website. So please do go onto our website and search future transactions, and you'll find all that information. But it's a fantastic starting point, Christina, of just the helpful sort of harm reduction advice and techniques, isn't it?
Absolutely.
And so, Christina, you touched upon this briefly earlier in the podcast, and I'd like to move the conversation now towards gambling and life in the armed forces. So you've been involved in quite extensive research on these topics. So I'm wondering if you could provide a little bit of insight on why gambling might prove potentially popular for those who are serving in the armed forces.
Yeah, so there are kind of a variety of ways that they can be connected. One of them is around recruitment. So that tends to happen when people are younger, and recruitment is higher among males, and potentially among people with fewer educational qualifications. And all of these are also risk factors for experiencing harm from gambling. So potentially there's quite a lot of overlap there. We also know that participation in gambling is higher in the armed forces community. So potentially there's this significant life stage transition happening when recruitment happens, where you're moving into an area where people are more likely to be gambling around you, and it might be used to manage or cope with stress that you might be experiencing around those changes. It can also play a cultural role. So if you're new to a team and gambling is something that's seen as a way of promoting bonding or team building, showing that you're going to be part of the team by taking part, and potentially that being used as a way to kind of create those relationships. We also know that people who've experienced traumatic life events are more likely to then experience harm from gambling, and people in the armed forces community, active service people, are more likely to have gone through that. So whether that's in their childhood experience of abuse or during service, such as witnessing somebody badly hurt or killed. And again, gambling can be used as a way to cope with negative emotions or potentially try to escape from them. People in active service are also potentially going through periods of separation with their family and loved ones. And there might be a sense of isolation or lower social support, or kind of stresses around those periods. And again, gambling might be used to try to cope with those. So there are a variety of ways that, or reasons that we might see this connection.
And I think it's a really interesting observation to make when you were talking about the marketing techniques earlier, that when you compare those marketing techniques with the recruitment activities of the armed forces, and potentially that focuses largely in deprived areas, predominantly, but not always, and that may present a significant number of those previously mentioned risk factors when it comes to compared to wider groups in society. So just to reiterate some of that, you're thinking, like you say, in most cases, recruits are on the younger side of the scale, potentially low educational attainment, potentially could have experienced childhood trauma, and potentially could have observed family members experiencing gambling harm too. And it's just such an interesting sort of comparison when you're thinking about what you just described there about you're going into a major period of transition, there's tribe formation, and then there's basically finding coping strategies for traumatic events and much more. So I think that's such a really interesting topic to talk about, how the risk factors can potentially come into it, but not always come into it, and how that can maybe potentially spiral into gambling harm.
Absolutely. I think it makes it, that kind of recruitment stage makes it a really important time to have support and information available on some of the risks and some of the ways of managing those risks, because as you say, there's massive overlap.
Yeah, because we talk about the younger recruits coming in that real significant period of transition, but equally too, I'm thinking about those who have maybe served for maybe 10, 15, 20 years, and you just mentioned there, time away from family, challenges maybe faced by a partner or their children, financial concerns, and much more. So it almost feels like there should be real greater awareness both at the younger end of the scale, but equally too at the older end of the scale in terms of those who are serving.
Absolutely. I think, too, potentially the transition away from active service is another stage that can be really an inflection point in people's experience of harm, because we know that when people are transitioning from active service to civilian life, that's a stage where risk-taking behaviors are increased, not just around gambling, but also substance use and dangerous driving and unsafe sexual practices. And again, that can be connected to finding ways to cope with stressful situations or changing sense of identity, as well as potentially it's a stage where difficult family conditions might play a role. So if there's increased tension in relationships with friends or family, or even potentially relationship breakdown, gambling might be used as a way to kind of cope with that. We also see veterans tend to present with more trauma-related conditions when they do experience harm from gambling. So that might be things like PTSD or substance use or suicidal behaviors or thoughts, as well as depression and anxiety. And so that can be quite challenging because when people present with a variety of kind of more complex needs, gambling often tends to be dealt with further down the list. So there might be this approach of let's deal with the things that we can see, and then we'll worry about gambling or other kind of more hidden experiences later. But that can make it quite challenging to progress, say, in recovery or to receive meaningful support if you've got an untreated or kind of unnoticed difficulties with gambling going on. It can also be difficult for people who are experiencing harm from their gambling due to stigma. So there might be reluctance to talk about gambling because maybe concern about judgment from whoever you might ask for help from, or concern that you won't be taken seriously in the way that you might be if you were experiencing difficulties with substances.
And, I think that's a great point to move on to the final topic, and we've already started to talk about it already there, but, making that transition from military to civilian life and the potential gambling harm and how that can spiral out of control. And I think, like I say, we both know that, making the transition from military to civilian life can be challenging. And I've noted down some of the key points here. For example, challenges associated with finding a home in civilian life, finding meaningful employment, integration with civilian communities, as you mentioned, loss of identity, community, support structures, and challenges faced by spouses, children, young people. So again, when you consider how challenging this transition can prove and the degree of time it might take to achieve that transition and a significant number of risk factors that you've talked about today, it can present itself as a real potential perfect storm, can't it, for gambling harm?
Absolutely. And unfortunately, we know that these two are so connected that you can almost see it coming. So it's certainly the case that if you're already engaged in gambling, or it's something that you're considering engaging with during transition points, to be particularly mindful of support available and mindful of your emotional state and your well-being when you're engaging with it, because it can be such a risk to be attempting to manage difficult situations using gambling.
Yeah. I'm just imagining, because we talked about the gambling behavior continuum earlier, and you're thinking just the potential level of stress. We're not going to say that everyone faces a severely challenging transition, but for those who do, I can just imagine the kind of stress that's experienced, that, like you were describing this behavior continuum, that the risks must be massive there. So it's really important to be really quite aware of that here. And I think this is where this podcast, might prove potentially useful for many veteran families.
Absolutely. The key message being reach out. So support is available for whatever you might be going through. And there's loads of dedicated gambling support that's confidential and non-judgmental. So the key message being reach out.
Absolutely. And I think just in closing, given, Forces Children Scotland's Future Transitions project focuses first and foremost on financial preparedness, on making that transition from military to civilian life, I think it's really clear how gambling harm can present really significant challenges from that perspective, from resources, basically to relationships and health. And like I say, you've mentioned so many of these things, from debt, financial insecurity, reduced disposable income, reduced credit scores, to rent, mortgage arrears, and much more. It's very clear how gambling harm can affect resources. But I think you made so many fantastic points there too, that gambling harm can affect relationships, because to physical and mental health. And I think the resources, relationships, and health, they're such key components to making that successful transition. So I think it's also really proved interesting to explore how life in the armed forces can also present potentially some heightened risks towards gambling harm. So, and it's also clearly backed up by research. So I really hope that anybody listening to this is really being able to take at least a good couple of things forward And, as we said earlier on, if you do feel you need further information, please do visit Forces Children Scotland's website and search future transactions. So I think all that's left for me to do is thank you for participating in our podcast, Christina. It's been fantastic to learn so much about the gambling industry and gambling harm. And also to thank you for everyone for watching.